The courtroom was eerily silent as Judge Martin Holloway leaned back in his chair, a smirk creeping onto his face. His voice, laced with condescension, echoed through the vast chamber. "Miss Bennett, do you have any idea where you are?" he asked, his sharp gaze fixed on the teenage girl standing before him. She had wild curls tumbling over her shoulders, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. As she shifted uneasily on the polished wooden floor, her sneakers let out a faint squeak. "This is a court of law, not some high school debate club." A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Seated behind polished desks, a few attorneys exchanged amused glances, clearly entertained by the spectacle. But the girl at the defendant's table didn't flinch. She stood firm, gripping a thick stack of legal papers that seemed almost too heavy for her small frame. Her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes, sharp and unwavering, remained locked on the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm despite the murmurs around her, "I'm here to—" Judge Holloway cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Spare me. This court doesn't have time for childish theatrics. I don't even understand why this was allowed in the first place." The girl raised her chin, her voice unwavering. "If you would allow me to speak, Your Honor, you might find it worth your time." A collective gasp filled the room. A teenager challenging a judge like that? Unheard of. Judge Holloway's smirk deepened, but his eyes darkened with irritation. "Well, by all means," he drawled mockingly, "enlighten us all." Taking a deep breath, the girl adjusted the papers in her hands and began to speak. What followed left the courtroom in stunned silence. Her words were precise, her argument seamless. She cited legal precedents, constitutional clauses, and court procedures with the confidence of a seasoned attorney. The lawyers who had chuckled moments earlier were now hastily scribbling notes. Judge Holloway's amusement faded into something else: uncertainty. Finally, he leaned forward, studying her with new intensity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice no longer mocking but genuinely bewildered. The girl met his gaze and allowed herself a small smile. "I'm Isabel Bennett," she said, "and I'm here to defend my client." The courtroom erupted. Lawyers whispered among themselves, reporters in the back hastily took notes, and the bailiff had to step forward to call for order. Judge Holloway struck his gavel, but there was no hiding the flicker of unease in his expression. How could a teenager command a courtroom like this? Who had allowed it? What was going on? And then for the first time, Isabel's calm smile wavered, just slightly. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, almost imperceptible. The courtroom fell silent once more, all eyes locked on her. What was she about to reveal? Isabel Bennett sat cross-legged on her small bed, surrounded by stacks of legal books and worn-out notebooks. Pages filled with handwritten notes covered the floor. None of the books belonged to her. They had been her older brother Nathan's, who had spent years studying for the bar exam. But Nathan wasn't around anymore. And so, Isabel had made it her mission to learn everything he had. Across the room, her best friend Maya Coleman sat on the bed, munching on a bag of chips. She watched Isabel with an expression that hovered between concern and disbelief. "Izzy, this is insane," Maya said, shaking her head. "You're 16. You're not a lawyer." Isabel paused, her pen hovering over the page of case summaries she had been writing. Then she looked up, her eyes serious. "I don't care what people think, I have to do this," Maya sighed. "But why?" she asked, her voice softening. "Why can't you just let it go?" Isabel didn't respond right away. She flipped through one of Nathan's old textbooks, tracing her fingers along the highlighted passages. Finally, she said, "Because someone has to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "And because Nathan believed in me." Maya didn't argue after that. Instead, she just watched as her best friend buried herself in books, preparing for something that should have been impossible. What Isabel hadn't told Maya, what she hadn't told anyone, was that her obsession with the law wasn't just about justice. It was about proving something. After Nathan's arrest, people had treated her like glass. Teachers, neighbors, even her own parents had tiptoed around her as if she might shatter at the wrong word. But she wasn't fragile, and she wasn't a child. She was smart, she was determined, and she was going to prove to everyone that she could make a difference. Isabel's composure had returned, but the atmosphere in the courtroom remained thick with tension. Judge Holloway, still visibly unsettled, leaned back in his chair and studied her closely. "Miss Bennett," he said slowly, "are you telling me you are representing the defendant?" Isabel met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly did you study law?" he asked, his tone still skeptical but no longer dripping with disdain. Isabel didn't falter. "I didn't attend law school, if that's what you're asking," she admitted. "But I've spent the last year studying legal texts and courtroom procedures. I've read every case related to this matter, and I believe I am qualified to defend my client." Judge Holloway let out a dry chuckle. "You believe you're qualified? That's not how this works." Isabel remained unfazed. "Then let me prove it." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The courtroom remained tense, every eye fixed on the judge. "Prove it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Martin Holloway opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A tall man strode inside, dressed in a sharply tailored suit. His presence commanded instant attention, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. A briefcase swung lightly in his hand, and his confident posture contrasted sharply with Isabel Bennett's simple hoodie and jeans. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people turned to each other, speculating about the newcomer. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice firm. "Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom?" The man stopped just before the judge's bench and placed his briefcase gently on the table. Then, with a respectful nod, he turned to face the judge. "My apologies, Your Honor. My name is Stephen Caldwell, and I'm here as a representative of the State Bar Association." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Isabel's heart pounded as she studied the man. Why was the Bar Association involved? Was this about her? Her grip on the stack of papers tightened. Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow. "The Bar Association? What interest do they have in this case?" Stephen Caldwell calmly flipped open his briefcase and pulled out a folder, scanning a few pages before responding. "It's not about the case itself, Your Honor. It's about representation." He shot a brief glance at Isabel before continuing. "We received an anonymous complaint regarding an unlicensed individual attempting to act as legal counsel in court. Naturally, this is a matter we take very seriously." The weight of his words settled over the room. Isabel's stomach lurched. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, preparing for weeks, poring over legal texts, ensuring she knew the case inside and out. And now, everything she had fought for was at risk of unraveling right in front of her. But she couldn't afford to panic. She forced herself to stand tall. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "Well, Mr. Caldwell, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular," he said, his tone amused. "As I was just saying, Miss Bennett has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best." Before Stephen Caldwell could respond, Isabel stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge of determination beneath it. "Your Honor, I understand that this situation is unusual, but I've done the research. I've prepared for this case as thoroughly as any lawyer would. My client deserves a fair defense." Judge Holloway's smirk widened. "Miss Bennett, this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even realize the seriousness of what you're attempting?" Isabel didn't hesitate. "I do, Your Honor, and I also realize that if my client doesn't have someone fighting for them, their life could be destroyed." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Some of the attorneys who had initially dismissed her were now looking at her with something close to respect. Judge Holloway frowned, clearly irritated by the shift in tone. Stephen Caldwell cleared his throat, redirecting the attention back to himself. "Your Honor, while I agree that this is an unusual circumstance, I also believe that justice should never be about technicalities. If Miss Bennett has truly prepared, it is only fair to hear her out." Judge Holloway exhaled sharply, glancing between Caldwell and Isabel. He drummed his fingers against the bench, weighing his decision. Finally, he sighed. "Fine," he said, leaning forward. "Miss Bennett, I'll allow you to continue, temporarily, but if I find that you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" Isabel felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Yes, Your Honor." She took a deep breath and steadied herself. The hardest part was far from over. Isabel hadn't always been fearless. A year ago, she had been just another teenager, more interested in hanging out with her friends than in fighting legal battles. But that all changed the day her brother Nathan was arrested. Nathan had been her hero, brilliant, kind, and fiercely protective. He had been just 2 months away from finishing law school when everything fell apart. One night, after leaving a small cafe, he got into an altercation with a wealthy businessman, Elliot Graves, outside a downtown bar. Elliot claimed Nathan had attacked him without reason. Nathan swore it was self-defense, but it didn't matter. He was arrested and charged. Their parents had tried everything, but they didn't have the resources to fight back against Elliot's power and influence. The public defender assigned to Nathan's case had been overworked and indifferent, barely putting up a fight in court. And so, in the end, Nathan was convicted, sentenced to 3 years in prison. Isabel had watched helplessly as the system, one her brother had believed in so deeply, failed him. But she refused to accept it. Instead, she made a decision. She would learn the law herself. She would fight for the people who didn't have the means to fight for themselves. And one day, she would make things right. Isabel Bennett had never believed in giving up. When the system failed her brother, she could have accepted it as an unfortunate truth. But she refused. Instead, she had spent every waking moment studying the law, determined to find a way to set things right. And now, standing in that courtroom, she was doing exactly that. She spoke with unwavering determination, presenting the evidence in her client's favor. Beside her, Mr. Calloway, a middle-aged man with worry etched deep into his features, sat stiffly at the defendant's table. He had been accused of embezzling funds from his employer, charges he vehemently denied. Isabel laid out the financial records, pointing out glaring discrepancies that suggested someone else was responsible. She cited legal precedents that reinforced her client's right to a thorough investigation. The courtroom hung on her every word. Even Judge Holloway, who had dismissed her earlier, now leaned forward slightly, his previously unreadable expression cracking into something resembling intrigue. For the first time, Isabel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. But then, Stephen Caldwell stood. His voice was measured and calm, but there was an undeniable weight to his words. Your Honor, while Miss Bennett's argument is impressive, it doesn't change the fundamental issue. She is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Tension thickened the air. Judge Holloway's expression hardened as he turned his sharp gaze back to Isabel. Miss Bennett, he said, his tone cold and deliberate, I'll give you one last chance to explain yourself. Who gave you the authority to act as legal counsel in this case? The question was inevitable. She had prepared for it, but now that the moment had arrived, her confidence wavered. Isabel opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors swung open once again. This time, it wasn't a suited professional who entered. It was a boy, no older than 10. Izzy. The child's voice sliced through the tense silence like a blade. Isabel turned, her breath catching in her throat. Owen? She whispered. The boy sprinted toward her, his small hands clutching a crumpled envelope. You forgot this, he said, thrusting it toward her. Isabel stared at it, her heart hammering. She recognized the envelope immediately. It was something she had never intended to reveal. Not here, not now. But with the entire courtroom watching, she had no way to avoid it. What was inside that envelope? And why did it matter so much? Isabel's hands trembled as she took the envelope from Owen. The weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on her. The entire courtroom strained to see what was so important about the small, crumpled piece of paper in her grasp. Miss Bennett, Judge Holloway's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. What's in that envelope? Isabel hesitated. Her mind raced. This letter, this piece of paper, contained something she had never planned to show anyone. Not here, not in front of a packed courtroom, and certainly not under the scrutinizing gaze of Judge Holloway. But Owen, in his innocent determination, had brought it here. And now, there was no turning back. She swallowed hard. She faltered. It's nothing that concerns this case, Your Honor. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Miss Bennet, you are already walking a very thin line. If you are withholding something pertinent to these proceedings, I assure you, it will not end well for you." Isabel's grip tightened around the envelope. She felt a small tug on her sleeve. She looked down. Owen was staring up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Show them, Izzy," he whispered. Her heart ached. He didn't understand the consequences of what he was asking her to do, but she couldn't blame him. He was just trying to help. She took a shaky breath and turned toward Mr. Calloway, her client. He looked just as confused as everyone else. Her fingers moved to open the envelope, but before she could, Stephen Caldwell stepped forward once more. "Your Honor," he interjected smoothly, "I believe we are losing focus. Whatever is inside that envelope is irrelevant to Miss Bennet's qualifications, or lack thereof, to represent a client." Judge Holloway raised a hand, silencing him. "I'll be the one to determine what's relevant here." Isabel gritted her teeth. If she revealed what was in the envelope, it could derail everything. But if she refused, Judge Holloway might hold her in contempt. The weight of the decision bore down on her. For the first time, she felt truly alone. "Miss Bennet," the judge repeated, his voice now a low warning. "I won't ask you again. Open the envelope." Isabel's gaze flicked between Owen, Mr. Calloway, and the judge. She had no choice. Slowly, she tore open the top of the envelope. The courtroom held its breath. She reached inside and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was a letter. Handwritten. Her brother's writing. Nathan's. Isabel's throat tightened as she unfolded the page, her eyes scanning words she already knew by heart. A plea. A message from the past. The last thing her brother had written to her before he was taken away. She knew every word by heart. The letter in Isabel's trembling hands was a plea, Nathan's final message to her before he was taken away. It was filled with encouragement, with hope, and with a challenge. Stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, no matter how impossible it seems. Isabel's hands shook as she held the letter, uncertainty gripping her for the first time. The entire courtroom was silent, waiting. The tension was thick, pressing in from every direction. "What is it, Miss Bennet?" Judge Holloway's voice was softer now, almost curious. Isabel hesitated, then slowly folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. "It's personal," she said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze. "And it has nothing to do with this case." For a moment, Judge Holloway said nothing. The room remained heavy with anticipation. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Fine," he said. "But understand this, Miss Bennet. This is your last chance. Any further disruptions, and I'll have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom." Relief flooded Isabel's chest. She turned to Owen, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you," she whispered, ruffling his hair. "Go sit with Maya now, okay?" Owen nodded eagerly and scampered to the back of the courtroom, where Maya Coleman sat, watching anxiously. Isabel turned back to the judge, ready to continue. But before she could speak, the doors to the courtroom burst open once again. This time, it wasn't a child, or a lawyer. It was a woman. Tall, with an air of absolute authority, she strode forward in a sharp black blazer, her hair pulled into a severe bun. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, locking onto Isabel like a predator sighting its prey. She didn't hesitate. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "My name is Celeste Harrington. I'm with the District Attorney's Office, and I'm here to address a matter of great importance." Judge Holloway frowned. "Miss Harrington, this is highly irregular. What matter could possibly justify interrupting my courtroom?" The woman's gaze shifted toward Isabel, her expression unreadable. "It concerns the unauthorized presence of this individual," she said, motioning toward Isabel, "and the consequences of allowing her to continue." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The air was suddenly thick with voices, shocked whispers, and gasps. Isabel felt her stomach drop. Celeste Harrington wasn't here to support her. She was here to tear her down. "Order." Judge Holloway's voice boomed as he banged his gavel. "Miss Harrington, you will explain yourself now." Celeste gave a sharp nod. "Of course, Your Honor." She turned back to the courtroom, her voice clear and authoritative. "I've come to inform this court that if Miss Bennet is allowed to proceed, it will constitute a serious violation of legal ethics. As a representative of the District Attorney's Office, it is my duty to ensure that the integrity of this court is upheld." Isabel's pulse thundered in her ears. She had fought so hard to get here, and now the entire system was conspiring to stop her. But she couldn't afford to crumble, not now. "Your Honor," she said, forcing strength into her voice despite the fear clawing at her insides, "I respectfully request the chance to prove myself. I may not have a law degree, but I've done the work. I've studied the law, and I believe I'm the best person to defend my client." Judge Holloway's expression was unreadable. He glanced at Celeste Harrington, then at Stephen Caldwell, and finally at the packed courtroom. The tension was suffocating. Everyone held their breath. Finally, the judge spoke. "I'll allow this hearing to continue," he said, his tone firm. "But Miss Bennett, you are now on very thin ice. If you falter even once, I will shut this down. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Isabel said, relief washing over her. But that relief was short-lived. Celeste Harrington took a step forward, a smirk played the corners of her mouth. "In that case, Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I'd like to call my first witness." Isabel's blood ran cold. Witness? She hadn't been prepared for this. As Celeste turned toward the doors, the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. A man stepped inside. The moment Isabel saw him, her body went rigid. She knew him instantly. A tailored navy suit. A confident, arrogant posture. The same smirk that had haunted her since Nathan's trial. Elliot Graves, her brother's accuser. Isabel felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. Why was he here? What did he have to do with this case? And what was Celeste planning to do next? Isabel's pulse pounded. This was an ambush, a calculated, ruthless attack designed to discredit her. Judge Holloway frowned, turning to Celeste Harrington. "Miss Harrington, Mr. Graves' presence is highly irregular," he said, skepticism evident in his tone. "Explain why this man's testimony is relevant to these proceedings." Celeste folded her hands neatly in front of her. "With respect, Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Graves has valuable insight into Miss Bennett's past. His testimony will reveal the underlying issues that make her unsuitable to act as legal counsel, even in an unconventional capacity." Isabel felt her palms grow clammy. This had nothing to do with Mr. Calloway's case. This was about her. She glanced at her client, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His unease was clear. He was beginning to doubt her. She had to act fast. "Your Honor," Isabel said, stepping forward, "I object to this witness. His testimony has no bearing on the facts of this case." Judge Holloway raised a hand, silencing her. "Miss Bennett, I'll decide what's relevant. Mr. Graves, take the stand." Isabel clenched her jaw as Elliot Graves strode to the witness stand, his smirk never faltering. He moved with the same arrogance that had defined him during Nathan's trial. As he took his seat and was sworn in, Isabel's thoughts raced. She had studied every angle of Mr. Calloway's case, anticipated every argument from the prosecution. But this was a blind side. Celeste stepped forward, her voice measured. "Mr. Graves, can you describe your prior interactions with Miss Bennett?" Elliot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I first encountered Miss Bennett during her brother's trial. He was convicted of assaulting me after a heated altercation outside a bar. The evidence was clear and the court found him guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Isabel's face burned. Not because Elliot was bringing up the past, but because he was twisting it, warping reality into something that suited his narrative. Celeste nodded, feigning concern. "And how did Miss Bennett behave during that time?" Elliot exhaled dramatically, as if recalling something exhausting. "She was disruptive," he said. "She attended every hearing, glaring at me like I was some kind of villain. Even after the trial, she wouldn't let it go. She sent letters, made phone calls, tried to reopen the case. It was obsessive." Isabel's nails dug into the wooden table. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward, "this has nothing to do with Mr. Calloway's case. This is an attempt to discredit me personally." Judge Holloway shot her a sharp look. "Miss Bennett, you will have your turn to respond. Sit down." Reluctantly, she obeyed. Her mind spun. The worst part? Elliot wasn't entirely lying. She had fought for Nathan after his conviction. She had written letters. She had made calls. Not out of obsession, out of love. Out of the desperate need to prove her brother's innocence. Celeste pressed on. "Mr. Graves, in your opinion, does Miss Bennett's behavior during her brother's trial suggest that she is fit to represent a client in a legal setting?" Elliot shook his head with mock sympathy. "Absolutely not. She's emotionally unstable. She has no respect for the legal system. Allowing her to act as counsel isn't just inappropriate, it's dangerous. His words hit Isabel like a punch to the stomach. She gripped the edges of the defendant's table, struggling to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to call him a liar, to remind the courtroom that he was the one who had destroyed her family. But she couldn't let him see her break. Celeste turned to Judge Holloway, her voice smooth as silk. Your Honor, this testimony demonstrates exactly why Miss Bennett should not be allowed to continue. Her actions during her brother's trial show a clear lack of professionalism and objectivity. She is unfit to represent anyone in court. Isabel shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is absurd, she said, fire returning to her voice. Mr. Graves is not a neutral party. He's the man who falsely accused my brother. The courtroom erupted into murmurs again. Order. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. Miss Bennett, you will conduct yourself appropriately, or I will hold you in contempt. Isabel inhaled sharply. She forced herself to calm down. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady but firm, Mr. Graves's testimony is biased and irrelevant. If this court is truly interested in justice, then I respectfully request the opportunity to cross-examine him. Judge Holloway hesitated. Clearly he was torn. Finally he nodded. Very well, Miss Bennett, you may proceed. Isabel took a step forward, her heart pounding. This was her chance to turn the tables. But it wouldn't be easy. Elliot was a manipulator, and with Celeste Harrington backing him, he had power. She had to be sharp, focused, fearless. She met his eyes. Mr. Graves, she began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. You claim that my actions during my brother's trial were disruptive. Can you provide specific examples? Elliot smirked. I don't have to. Everyone in that courtroom saw how you behaved. Isabel folded her arms. That's not an answer. If you're going to accuse me of being disruptive, then you need to provide evidence. Otherwise, your testimony is just opinion. For the first time, Elliot's smirk faltered slightly. He hesitated. Then, fine, he said. You were loud, argumentative. You refused to accept the court's decision. Isabel narrowed her eyes. And do you believe those actions motivated by a desire to fight for my brother, make me incapable of defending my client today? Elliot's smirk widened. Yes, he said bluntly. You're too emotional to handle a case like this. Isabel's eyes narrowed. Too emotional or too determined to stop people like you from exploiting the system for your own gain? A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Miss Bennett, watch your tone. Isabel nodded, but never broke eye contact with Elliot. Mr. Graves, let's talk about the evidence in my brother's case, she said, her voice calm but cutting. Specifically, the security footage from the bar. Do you recall why it was never admitted in court? Elliot's expression darkened. It was ruled inadmissible. Why? Isabel pressed, her voice sharpening. Was it because it contradicted your claim of assault? Elliot shifted uncomfortably. I'm not here to discuss your brother's case. Isabel took a step closer. No, you're here to discredit me. But if we're going to question my credibility, then we need to question yours too. The tension in the room was suffocating. Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a loud crash echoed from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned. A man stood in the doorway, his face pale, his breathing labored. His hands trembled as he held up a USB drive like a lifeline. I have evidence, he declared, his voice unsteady. Evidence that proves everything she's saying is true. Chaos erupted once again. Isabel froze, her heart hammering. Who was this man, and what did he have? More importantly, how was it connected to her case? The man stumbled forward, his disheveled suit and haunted eyes making it clear. He had wrestled with this decision for a long time. But now he was here. Judge Holloway pounded his gavel. Order in the court, he commanded. Who are you, and what is the meaning of this interruption? The man swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. My name is Thomas Raines, he said, his voice shaky but strong enough to carry through the room. I used to work for Elliot Graves. A stunned murmur spread through the courtroom. Elliot's face drained of color. His smug confidence vanished in an instant. He jumped to his feet. Your Honor, I object to this man's intrusion, Elliot snapped. He has no business here. Judge Holloway's gaze flickered between Raines and Elliot. His brow furrowed. Mr. Raines, you've disrupted my courtroom. This better be important. Raines nodded quickly, clutching the USB drive. Your Honor, I have evidence that contradicts Mr. Graves' testimony. A fresh wave of whispers swept through the room. Isabel's breath caught. Footage. The security footage that had been withheld during Nathan's trial. She gripped the edge of the defendant's table, her knuckles turning white. This is outrageous, Elliot snapped. That footage was deemed inadmissible years ago. It's irrelevant now. Raines took a step forward, his voice growing stronger. It wasn't inadmissible, it was suppressed. By you, Mr. Graves. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Judge Holloway banged his gavel repeatedly. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Isabel's pulse raced. She didn't know Thomas Raines, didn't know why he was coming forward now. But she could feel the shift. The tides were turning. This wasn't just about Mr. Calloway anymore. This was about Nathan. And this was her chance. Judge Holloway turned to Raines, his voice stern. Mr. Raines, do you have any proof to support these claims? Raines nodded, lifting the USB drive again. It's all here, Your Honor. The footage, the records showing how it was deliberately buried. Elliot's face twisted in fury. Your Honor, this man is lying, he spat. He's a disgruntled former employee trying to settle a personal vendetta. Isabel stood, her voice steady but urgent. Your Honor, if this evidence is genuine, it could prove that my brother was wrongfully convicted. And it would also show that Mr. Graves' testimony today is biased and unreliable. The judge let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. This case is about Mr. Calloway, not your brother, Miss Bennett. A pause. Then, however, if there is evidence that speaks to the credibility of a key witness, it must be considered. Elliot's jaw clenched. This is a farce, Your Honor. I demand you throw this man out and strike his claims from the record. Judge Holloway ignored him. He turned to the bailiff. Retrieve the drive. Have our IT specialist review its contents. We'll determine its authenticity. The bailiff walked over to Raines, took the USB drive and handed it to the judge. As the bailiff left the courtroom to deliver the drive for verification, the weight of the moment settled over the room. Every eye was on Elliot, and for the first time, he looked cornered. The air in the courtroom was suffocating. All eyes were on Elliot Graves. But he no longer looked like the confident accuser. Now, he looked like a man cornered. The room was completely still as everyone waited for the footage to be reviewed. If it was real, it could vindicate Nathan. It could expose Elliot for the liar he was. But one question burned in Isabel's mind. Why had Thomas Raines come forward now? After all this time? She glanced at Mr. Calloway, who sat frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mix of confusion and hope. Isabel leaned toward him, whispering, I'm sorry this is getting so complicated. He turned to her, offering a small smile. Don't apologize, he murmured. You're fighting harder for me than anyone else ever has. Her chest tightened. She hadn't expected to feel this connected to his case, but he reminded her so much of Nathan. Falsely accused. The odds stacked against him. She resolved to keep fighting, no matter what. After what felt like an eternity, the bailiff returned. He handed a laptop to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, he said, the footage is authentic. It hasn't been tampered with. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Judge Holloway nodded, then turned to the bailiff. Play the footage. The laptop screen was turned toward the court. The bailiff clicked play. The grainy black and white video flickered to life. It was the bar that night. Elliot Graves was there, sitting at a table with several associates, laughing, drinking. Then, Nathan entered the frame, calm, composed. He approached Elliot, said something that wasn't audible, then turned to leave. But what happened next froze the entire courtroom. As Nathan walked away, Elliot stood up, grabbed his arm, and shoved him. Nathan turned, not aggressively, not violently. He was clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. But then, Elliot threw the first punch. The fight that followed was brief, but it was clear who the aggressor was. Elliot, not Nathan. The courtroom was silent. The truth was right there. Isabel felt tears sting her eyes. This was proof. Nathan had acted in self-defense. She turned to look at Elliot. His face had turned a deep shade of red. The footage ended. The room remained dead quiet. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. He exhaled, then turned to Elliot. Mr. Graves, he said, his voice cold. Care to explain this? Elliot stammered. His confidence crumbled. Your Honor, I don't know what this man is trying to pull, but... That's enough. Judge Holloway's voice was sharp. His patience had run out. This court will not tolerate perjury or obstruction of justice. Mr. Caldwell, I suggest you reevaluate the value of this witness's testimony. Stephen Caldwell, who had remained silent through the chaos, nodded slowly. Understood, Your Honor. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, Isabel stepped forward. Her voice was strong. Your Honor, this evidence not only discredits Mr. Graves, but it also calls into question the integrity of his accusations against my brother. Judge Holloway studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Duly noted, Miss Bennett. But let me remind you, this case is about Mr. Calloway. Keep your focus on defending your client. Yes, Your Honor, Isabel said, but her mind was already racing. If she could bring this evidence to light, it wouldn't just save Mr. Calloway. It could reopen Nathan's case. As the courtroom settled, Celeste Harrington stood. Her expression was steely. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to regroup in light of this new evidence. Judge Holloway sighed, glancing at the clock. Fine, we'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Isabel sat down heavily. Her head spun. She had won this battle. But the war was far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that Celeste and Elliot weren't done yet. Whatever they had planned next, it would be even more dangerous. She tapped her fingers against the table, lost in thought. The footage had been a game changer. Proof of Elliot's lies, proof of Nathan's innocence. But she knew this was just the beginning. People like Elliot didn't crumble without a fight, and Celeste wasn't the type to give up easily. A familiar voice snapped her out of her thoughts. That was insane. Isabel looked up. Maya slid into the seat beside her. Behind her, Owen trailed along, his eyes wide with excitement. You totally crushed him. Isabel managed a faint smile. It's not over yet. Owen tugged on her sleeve. You're gonna win, right? He asked, his voice full of hope. You're going to prove everyone wrong? Isabel's heart ached. She didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep. I'm going to try my best, Owen. That's all I can do. The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied. Maya leaned in closer, lowering her voice. Who was that guy? The one with the USB? Isabel shook her head. I have no idea. But if he hadn't shown up when he did. She trailed off, not wanting to think about how much worse things could have been. As the courtroom reconvened, a murmur of whispers rippled through the room. Elliot Graves had returned. His face was stone cold, but his rigid posture betrayed his growing unease. Beside him, Celeste Harrington stood tall, her demeanor sharp and unshaken. Judge Holloway entered, his gavel striking down sharply. Let's get back to business. His piercing gaze swept across the courtroom before settling on Isabel. Miss Bennett, the floor is yours. Isabel stood, her pulse quickening. She had spent months preparing for this case, anticipating every possible counter-argument. But now, the stakes had never been higher. With Elliot's credibility shattered, she knew Celeste would go on the offensive. Every word she spoke needed to count. She took a steadying breath and began. Your Honor, she said, her voice unwavering, as I've demonstrated, there are significant flaws in the prosecution's case against my client, Mr. Calloway. Her eyes scanned the room, her confidence building. The evidence presented so far lacks both credibility and substance. I intend to show that the accusations against him are not only unfounded, but part of a larger effort to scapegoat an innocent man. She proceeded to lay out her argument. Documents, financial records, timelines, each piece carefully contradicting the claims against Mr. Calloway. Her delivery was clear, methodical, each point building on the last. The courtroom hung on her every word. Even Judge Holloway, who rarely showed emotion, gave a slight nod, almost as if he were grudgingly impressed. She had them, or so she thought, because the moment she finished, Celeste Harrington stood, her lips pressed into a thin, knowing line. Your Honor, Celeste said smoothly, while Miss Bennett's presentation was thorough, it does not absolve her client of the charges. She turned to a courtroom clerk and gave a small nod. A folder was handed to her. In fact, she continued, flipping through the papers, I have additional evidence to present. Evidence that will solidify the case against Mr. Calloway. Isabel tensed as Celeste approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, Celeste said, handing the folder to him, this document outlines a series of emails exchanged between Mr. Calloway and another employee at his company, suggesting his involvement in the alleged embezzlement. Judge Holloway opened the folder, his expression darkening as he read. Isabel's stomach twisted. She turned to Mr. Calloway. His face had gone pale, as if he'd just been punched in the gut. "Emails?" Isabel asked, her voice sharp. Celeste's smirk barely concealed her triumph. "Yes, Miss Bennett. Emails that prove your client's guilt." Judge Holloway examined the documents. Finally, he passed them to Isabel. She took them with steady hands, but as she scanned the pages, her heart sank. The emails looked real. Timestamps, headers, official company formatting. They painted a damning picture, one where Mr. Calloway appeared to be conspiring to siphon funds. But something felt off. Too blunt, too careless, too perfect. She turned to Celeste, her voice firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to question the authenticity of these emails. Given the inconsistencies we've already seen in this case, it's not unreasonable to suspect that this evidence may have been fabricated." Celeste's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing the prosecution of falsifying evidence, Miss Bennett?" Isabel didn't blink. "I'm saying we need to verify the source." She let the words hang in the air, the implication crystal clear. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Miss Harrington, how were these emails obtained?" Celeste didn't hesitate. They were provided by an anonymous source within the company. Isabel's jaw clenched. Anonymous source. Convenient. Too convenient. "Your Honor," she said, "I request that the emails be subjected to forensic analysis to confirm their authenticity." Judge Holloway considered her request, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. Then finally, "Very well. The court will recess until the emails can be reviewed by an independent forensic expert." Celeste's composure faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But Isabel caught it. And for the first time since the trial began, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't backing down, not now. During the recess, Isabel sat with Mr. Calloway in a quiet corner of the courthouse. The man looked defeated. His shoulders slumped. His hands trembled slightly. "I didn't send those emails," he whispered. "I swear I didn't." Isabel met his gaze. "I believe you." His breath hitched. "We'll prove it," she promised. But he shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he murmured. "They've already decided I'm guilty. You saw how they looked at me." Isabel reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not guilty, and I won't let them railroad you." Her voice was strong. "You have to trust me." For the first time, hope flickered in his tired eyes. "You remind me of my daughter," he said softly. "She never gave up on anyone either." Isabel's throat tightened. She swallowed hard. "Then I won't give up on you." Hours later, the courtroom reconvened. The forensic analyst stood at the witness stand, a report clutched in his hands. The tension in the room was electric. Judge Holloway addressed him. "Have you completed your analysis of the emails?" The analyst nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, and my findings are conclusive." A pause. Then, the emails in question were forged. Gasps filled the courtroom. Isabel's chest tightened with vindication. She turned to Celeste, whose face remained unreadable. But Isabel could see it. The barely concealed fury underneath. Judge Holloway banged his gavel. "This is a serious development, Miss Harrington." The tides had turned again, and for the first time, Isabel felt that they weren't just winning the case. They were exposing something much bigger. "The court will not tolerate the submission of falsified evidence," Judge Holloway declared, his sharp gaze locking onto Celeste Harrington. "You will need to explain how this occurred." Celeste opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Elliot Graves shot to his feet, his face flushed red with fury. "This is all her doing," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Isabel. "She's manipulating this court to serve her own agenda." "Enough." Judge Holloway's voice boomed through the courtroom as he slammed his gavel. "Mr. Graves, sit down or I will have you removed." Elliot hesitated, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then after a long, seething pause, he slowly lowered himself back into his seat. But the anger in his eyes didn't fade. It burned deeper, more dangerous than before. Isabel's pulse quickened. She could feel it. Something was about to happen. And then, it did. The heavy courtroom doors swung open again, drawing all eyes to the entrance. A man walked in, tall and disheveled, his face gaunt with exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and there was something haunted in his expression as he locked eyes with Isabel. His hands trembled at his sides, but his voice was steady as he spoke. "I need to speak." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm cloud waiting to break. His voice wavered, but his resolve held firm. I'm the one who forged the emails, and I did it because Elliot Graves told me to. Chaos erupted instantly. Gasps filled the room, followed by a cacophony of shouts as people scrambled to process what they had just heard. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced to piece everything together. Who was this man? And what did his confession mean for everything she had been fighting for? Judge Holloway's gavel slammed down repeatedly, his deep voice cutting through the noise. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. The man hesitated near the entrance, his eyes darting nervously between Elliot and the judge. He looked as though he was weighing whether to flee or stand his ground. Step forward, Judge Holloway commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. State your name and explain yourself. The man swallowed hard before slowly walking toward the stand, each step heavy with reluctance. My name is Ryan Maddox, he said, his voice trembling. I worked for Mr. Graves. The moment those words left his lips, Elliot sprang to his feet again, his face twisting in fury. Your Honor, this man is lying, he spat. He's a disgruntled employee trying to drag me down with baseless accusations. Judge Holloway's glare was ice cold. Mr. Graves, you will sit down and remain silent until it is your turn to speak. Elliot's jaw clenched, his breathing heavy, but this time he obeyed. He sank into his seat, though the fire in his eyes burned hotter than ever. Isabel studied him carefully. Her instincts screamed that he was on the verge of losing control. Judge Holloway turned back to Ryan. Mr. Maddox, you've made a serious allegation. Explain yourself, quickly and clearly. Ryan hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Then, his voice cracking, he began. I was hired by Mr. Graves to falsify those emails. The courtroom erupted again, but Judge Holloway silenced it with another slam of his gavel. Ryan's hands shook as he continued. He told me to make it look like Mr. Calloway was guilty of embezzlement. He said it was just a necessary step to protect the company's reputation. A cold shiver ran down Isabel's spine. This was huge. But why now? Why was Ryan coming forward after all this time? And what else was Elliot hiding? Judge Holloway's voice cut through her thoughts. Mr. Maddox, do you have any evidence to support these claims? Ryan nodded quickly and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small hard drive, holding it up like it was a lifeline. Everything's on here. Emails, instructions, payments, all of it. The bailiff stepped forward, retrieving the hard drive and handing it to Judge Holloway, who leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. This court will review the contents, he stated. Until then, we will proceed with extreme caution. His gaze then shifted to Isabel. Miss Bennett, do you wish to question this witness? Isabel rose to her feet, inhaling deeply to steady herself. This was it, her chance to drive the final nail into Elliot Graves's defense. Yes, Your Honor. She walked toward Ryan Maddox, locking eyes with him. His hands fidgeted in his lap, beads of sweat forming along his brow. He looked like a man teetering on the edge of collapse. Mr. Maddox, Isabel began, her voice calm but firm. Why are you coming forward now? Ryan hesitated. His eyes flickered briefly toward Elliot, as if checking to see how much danger he was putting himself in. Finally, he exhaled shakily. I couldn't live with it anymore. At first, I thought it was just business, just following orders. But then I saw how far it was going, how many people it was hurting. His voice wavered before strengthening. And I have a daughter. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Isabel felt something twist deep in her chest. Ryan lowered his gaze. I couldn't look her in the eye, knowing I'd done something like this. Softening her tone, Isabel asked, You're saying Mr. Graves directly instructed you to falsify evidence against my client? Ryan nodded firmly. Yes. And he told you exactly what to do? Yes. And he paid you to keep quiet? Yes. A pause. Isabel's voice sharpened. Did he threaten you in any way? Ryan hesitated, then nodded. He said if I didn't do it, he'd ruin me. He told me he'd make sure I never worked in this industry again. Judge Holloway leaned forward, listening intently. Isabel took a step back and turned to face him. Your Honor, I believe this testimony casts significant doubt on the credibility of Mr. Graves and the prosecution's case. She let her words settle before finishing. I request that this court take this into serious consideration moving forward. Judge Holloway studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. Duly noted, Miss Bennett. Isabel exhaled, stealing a glance at Elliot Graves. He sat rigid in his seat, His jaw locked, his fists clenched at his sides. But for the first time since this trial began, he looked truly afraid. Judge Holloway's expression was grim as he turned his attention to Elliot Graves. "Mr. Graves, this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented. You are hereby detained for further investigation into your conduct. Bailiffs, take him into custody." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as two uniformed officers moved toward Elliot. He stood abruptly, his face twisting with fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his glare locking onto Isabel. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Isabel held his gaze, refusing to flinch. She saw it, the desperation in his eyes, the fear creeping beneath his rage. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and he knew it. The bailiffs took him by the arms and led him toward the exit. As the doors swung shut behind them, the tension in the room finally eased. But Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that Graves's parting words weren't just empty threats. Celeste Harrington remained standing, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clipped. "While this development is significant, it does not absolve the defendant. The charges against Mr. Calloway still stand." Isabel rose to her feet. "Your Honor, with respect, every piece of evidence against my client has been discredited. The prosecution's case is built on lies. It's clear Mr. Calloway was framed." A long silence stretched across the room as Judge Holloway considered her words. Then he nodded slowly. "I agree. Based on the evidence presented, the charges against Mr. Calloway are hereby dismissed." The words hit Isabel like a wave of relief. She turned to her client, who sat frozen in shock. "You're free," she whispered. Tears welled in his eyes. "It's over." For a moment he just stared at her, as if he couldn't believe it. Then a shaky breath escaped him, and he covered his face with his hands. The weight of it all, the fear, the uncertainty, finally lifted. The courtroom erupted into cheers. Reporters scrambled outside, eager to break the story. As Isabel and Mr. Calloway stepped into the bright afternoon sun, cameras flashed and microphones were thrust in their direction. "You saved my life," Mr. Calloway said, his voice trembling with gratitude. "I don't know how I can ever thank you." Isabel smiled, exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You don't have to. Just live your life. Take care of the people who matter to you." He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. "You're going to be an incredible lawyer someday." The praise felt good, but Isabel's mind was already racing ahead. Graves's final words echoed in her head. "This isn't over. Men like him didn't go down without a fight." And she suspected he had more cards left to play. Maya and Owen were waiting at the edge of the crowd, their faces lit with excitement. "Isabel," Maya shouted, waving wildly. "You're famous now. Look at all these reporters." Isabel laughed, though she could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. "Let's get out of here," she said. "I need a break." Later that evening, she sat at her small kitchen table, flipping through Nathan's old law books. The victory in court felt like a dream now, distant, surreal. But her mind kept drifting back to the bigger picture. Graves's arrest was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. Nathan was still in prison. His wrongful conviction was a shadow over her triumph. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Maya. "Hey," Isabel said as she answered. "What's up?" Maya's voice was hurried, almost frantic. "Isabel, have you seen the news?" "No," Isabel frowned. "Why? Turn it on. Now." A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. The screen lit up with a breaking news banner. The anchor's voice was calm, but the words that followed made Isabel's blood run cold. "Breaking news tonight. Elliot Graves, who was detained earlier today on charges of fabricating evidence, has been released on bail." Her heart stopped. "Released? Already?" She barely heard the rest of the broadcast. Her fingers tightened around the remote as Graves's smug face appeared on the screen, stepping out of a courthouse with his high-powered legal team surrounding him. Her gut told her the fight was far from over. She had exposed his lies. Now she had to make sure he never got the chance to cover them up again. Elliot Graves had barely spent a day in custody before his high-powered legal team secured his release on bail. "The allegations against Mr. Graves," the news anchor stated, "are being described by his attorneys as a politically motivated smear campaign orchestrated by former employees with personal grudges." Isabel's jaw tightened as she stared at the screen. "Of course he's flipping the narrative." Maya's voice crackled through the phone. Isabel, are you hearing this? He's not going down without a fight. I know, Isabel murmured, her mind racing. He's trying to paint himself as the victim. It's exactly what I expected. Maya hesitated. What are you going to do? Isabel's grip on the remote tightened as her resolve hardened. I'm going to fight, she said. He's not getting away with this. The next morning, she woke early and headed to the local library. She knew that taking down someone like Graves required more than just determination. It required evidence. Real, undeniable evidence. Something that couldn't be spun, dismissed, or buried. She pored over public records, financial documents, and anything else that might expose his deeper wrongdoings. Hours passed, and the library emptied as the sun set, but she refused to stop. And then, she found it. A series of payments made to an obscure consulting firm. The amounts were large, irregular, and, most importantly, they lined up perfectly with key dates in Nathan's trial. Isabel's heart raced. The consulting firm's name wasn't familiar, but the pattern was unmistakable. Was this the missing link? Could it prove that Graves had orchestrated the suppression of evidence in her brother's case? She pushed forward, exhaustion forgotten as she scrolled through more records. Then, a name appeared. Thomas Raines. The same man who had burst into the courtroom with the USB drive. He wasn't just a random whistleblower. He was connected to Graves's operation. If she could get him to talk, really talk, she might finally have the evidence she needed to exonerate Nathan. The next day, Isabel tracked him down. Raines lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. The building was old, its paint peeling, the hallways dimly lit. Isabel's heart pounded as she knocked. A long pause. Then, the door creaked open just a sliver. Raines peered out, his eyes wary. You shouldn't be here, he said in a low voice. It's not safe. I need your help, Isabel said, keeping her voice calm but firm. You came forward in court, but there's more to this, isn't there? You know things about Graves, things that could clear my brother's name. Raines hesitated, his expression darkening. He glanced down the hallway, as if expecting someone to be watching. You don't understand, he muttered. People like Graves don't just let things go. If I say too much, I'll be next. I'll protect you, Isabel promised. You did the right thing once. Do it again, and we can take him down for good. Raines exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. You don't get it, kid. His voice was hollow, tired. This goes deeper than you think. Graves is just the tip of the iceberg. There are people behind him, powerful people. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried. A cold knot formed in Isabel's stomach, but she didn't back down. If we don't fight them, she said, they'll keep doing this. Innocent people, like my brother, will keep paying the price. Something shifted in Raines's expression. He studied her for a long moment, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly, but if we do this, you need to be ready. Once we start pulling at these threads, there's no going back. I'm ready. Raines stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. As the door clicked shut behind her, he sighed. All right, he said, let's get to work. For the next few days, Isabel and Raines worked in secret, piecing together the web of corruption surrounding Graves. Every file, every document, every record they uncovered led to more questions and more danger. Isabel knew she was walking a thin line, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. Then, one night, it all came crashing down. She had just returned home from another late meeting with Raines when she froze in the doorway of her apartment. The door was ajar. Her stomach plummeted. A sharp chill crept down her spine as she pushed it open, her pulse hammering in her ears. Inside, chaos. Her apartment was ransacked, papers scattered, furniture overturned, her laptop gone. And then her eyes landed on the kitchen table. A single note sat there, scrawled in bold, menacing letters. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. The room spun. Isabel's breath came in shallow gasps as Graves's words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise. Isabel stared at the threatening note on her kitchen table, her hands trembling. The words, stay out of this, or you'll regret it, were burned into her mind. Whoever had done this wanted to scare her. They didn't know her. She grabbed her phone and dialed Maya. Maya, she said, her voice shaking. Someone broke into my apartment. Maya's voice shot up in alarm. What? Are you okay? Where are you now? I'm fine, Isabel said, though her heart was still racing. I just got home, and everything's trashed. They took my laptop. Maya's voice softened. Isabel, you need to call the police. Isabel hesitated. I don't know. What if they can't do anything? What if this just escalates things? You can't handle this alone, Maya said firmly. Promise me you'll at least tell someone. Isabel sighed, pressing her fingers to her temple. Okay, I'll call. The police arrived within the hour. 2 officers surveyed the damage, their faces grim as Isabel explained the situation. She handed them the note, watching as one of them bagged it as evidence. Do you have any idea who might have done this? One of the officers asked. Isabel hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much and risk tipping off Graves or his allies. I've been involved in a legal case, she said carefully. It's possible this is connected to that. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. We'll file a report and have our team look into it. In the meantime, I'd suggest staying somewhere else for a few days, just to be safe. Thanks, Isabel murmured, though she knew she couldn't afford to slow down. If anything, this attack only reinforced her resolve. The next morning, Isabel met Thomas Raines at a quiet diner, far from her usual haunts. She hadn't told him about the break-in over the phone, worried their calls might be monitored. When she explained what had happened, his face darkened. This is exactly what I warned you about, Raines said in a low voice. Graves's people don't play fair. If they're willing to break into your apartment, they're willing to do worse. I'm not scared of them, Isabel said, though she felt a pang of doubt deep in her chest. We're too close to the truth to stop now. Raines shook his head. You don't get it. It's not just Graves. There's an entire network of people behind him. Politicians, executives, even law enforcement. They all have something to lose if we expose this. Isabel leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Then we expose all of them. Raines exhaled, rubbing his temples. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But guts won't protect you if they decide you're too much of a threat. Isabel thought about the note. The violation of her safe space, the weight of what she was up against. Then she thought about Nathan, sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. She thought about Mr. Calloway, whose life had nearly been destroyed. She couldn't walk away. Not now. What's the next step? She asked, her voice steady. Raines hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. This is everything I've got on the consulting firm. If we can trace the money, we'll find the people pulling the strings. Isabel opened the folder and scanned the bank transfers, invoices, internal memos, each piece another part of the puzzle. Her mind raced as she pieced together the connections, a web of corruption beginning to take shape. This is huge, she whispered. If we can prove this. It's not enough, Raines interrupted. We need more. Something that directly ties these people to their crimes. Isabel nodded. Then we'll find it. That evening, Isabel returned to Maya's apartment, where she had decided to stay for the time being. Maya greeted her at the door, her face etched with worry. You look exhausted, she said, pulling her inside. I don't have a choice, Isabel murmured, sinking onto the couch. If we don't move fast, Graves and his people will bury everything. Maya sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea. Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want to lose you. Isabel smiled faintly. I promise. A few nights later, Isabel and Raines made their move. Armed with the information from the folder, they infiltrated an office building owned by the consulting firm. The plan was risky. Find the files they needed, copy them, and get out before anyone noticed. The building was quiet as they slipped inside, the dim glow of emergency lights guiding their way. Raines led the way to a small server room, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. This is it, he whispered, pulling out a flash drive. Watch the door. Isabel nodded, her heart pounding as she kept an eye on the hallway. The minutes dragged by, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, Raines let out a quiet exclamation of triumph. Got it, he said, pocketing the flash drive. Let's go. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Isabel's stomach dropped. 2 security guards appeared, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Hey! Stop right there! Stop right there! One of the guards shouted. Isabel and Raines froze, their minds racing. They had been caught. And now, the stakes had just risen to a dangerous new level. The guards closed in, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit hallway like spotlights. Isabel glanced at Rains, who looked just as frozen as she felt. Her mind scrambled for an escape plan, knowing that getting caught would mean losing everything they had just risked so much to uncover. "Stay calm," Rains whispered under his breath, though his trembling hands betrayed his own nerves. "Hands where we can see them," one of the guards ordered, stepping closer. Slowly, Isabel raised her hands, her heart pounding like a drum. She exchanged a glance with Rains, her eyes silently pleading for an idea. Any idea. But before either of them could speak, one of the guards reached for his radio. "This is Team A," the guard said. "We've got 2 intruders on the 2nd floor, requesting backup." The second guard gestured with his flashlight. "Move, both of you. You're coming with us." Isabel's pulse quickened. If they were taken in now, it was over. They had to act. Now. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We can explain." The guards exchanged skeptical looks. "Explain what?" one of them asked. "You're trespassing." Isabel nodded quickly, trying to buy time. "You're right, and we'll go with you. But first, I need to show you something. It's on that flash drive." Rains shot her a startled look, but she ignored him. The guards hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her calm demeanor. "Look," she continued, her tone urgent. "What's on that drive could save your jobs, maybe even your lives, but only if you see it before you call for backup." One of the guards frowned. "What kind of game are you playing?" "No games," Isabel said, lowering her voice. "Do you know who you work for? Do you know what they're hiding?" The guards exchanged uneasy glances. "You've seen things, haven't you?" Isabel pressed, sensing a crack in their resolve. "Things that don't add up? This drive has the proof. Just give us 5 minutes. If you still think we're lying, we'll go quietly." The first guard's flashlight wavered. "You've got 2 minutes," he said gruffly. "But if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not," Isabel said quickly. She handed the flash drive to Rains, who inserted it into his laptop with shaking hands. The guards leaned in as the screen lit up, revealing a series of incriminating files, emails detailing bribes, invoices for fabricated evidence, wire transfers to offshore accounts. The guards' faces darkened as they scrolled through the files. This is real," one of them muttered. Isabel nodded. "That's why we're here. If this gets out, the people behind it will try to bury us. And you. But if we work together, we can stop them." The guards exchanged a long, heavy look. Finally, the first one sighed. "We didn't see you," he said, stepping back. "But you need to leave. Now." "Thank you," Isabel said, her voice filled with relief. She and Rains packed up quickly, the tension in the air still thick as they slipped out of the building. The moment they were outside, Isabel let out a slow breath, her heart still racing. They had narrowly escaped, but the evidence they had gathered could change everything. Back at Maya's apartment, Isabel and Rains pored over the files in detail. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer, darker picture of the corruption at the heart of Elliot Graves's operations. But as they pieced it together, an even more terrifying truth began to emerge. "This isn't just about Graves," Rains said, his voice grim. "He's part of something much bigger. These accounts, these payments, they trace back to major corporations and even politicians." Isabel's stomach turned. She had expected corruption, but not on this scale. "What do we do with this?" she asked. "If we go public, they'll come after us." Rains hesitated, then nodded. "We need to find someone who can protect us and expose this at the same time. Someone with real power." The next day, Isabel reached out to someone she had read about in one of Nathan's old law books. Sarah Green, a fearless, investigative journalist known for taking down high-profile criminals. Isabel sent her an encrypted email, detailing what they had found and asking for a meeting. To her surprise, Sarah responded within hours. The meeting was set for that evening at a discreet cafe downtown. Isabel and Rains arrived early, their nerves on edge. When Sarah walked in, her presence was commanding. She wore a leather jacket and carried a laptop bag slung over one shoulder. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before she approached their table. "You must be Isabel," Sarah said, sitting down. She turned to Rains. "And you're Thomas Rains." She didn't waste time. "Let's see what you've got." Rains handed over the flash drive, and Sarah plugged it into her laptop. As she reviewed the files, her expression grew more intense. After several long minutes, she finally looked up at them. This, she said, leaning forward, is huge. If this is all verified, it could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. The cabin was silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of Isabel's laptop keys as she scrolled through the latest news. Sarah's article had exploded across the country, sending shockwaves through government offices and corporate boardrooms alike. The DOJ had opened an investigation, and protests were growing louder by the hour. But none of that mattered now, not when Elliot Graves had vanished. He was still out there, and now he knew exactly who had destroyed him. Across the dimly lit kitchen, Rains sat hunched over his phone, eyes locked on the screen. Isabel could feel his tension without even looking. He had been restless since they arrived, checking updates, double-checking security measures, keeping an ear out for anything unusual. "You should get some sleep," Isabel said softly. Rains didn't look up. "Not yet. Something doesn't feel right." "You think we were followed?" "I think Graves isn't the kind of man who runs away without a plan," he muttered. "And I think the second we let our guard down, he'll make his move." The warning text they had received from an anonymous number still lingered in Isabel's mind. "Get out while you can. They know where you are." They had left the city immediately, traveling deep into the woods to one of Rain's contacts, an old friend with a secluded cabin. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now. But Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. By morning, the entire country was searching for Graves. Authorities are urging anyone with information on the whereabouts of businessman Elliot Graves to come forward, the news anchor said. Graves, the central figure in a massive corruption scandal, failed to appear in court yesterday morning. Law enforcement officials suspect he may have fled the country. Isabel clenched her jaw. That was a lie. Graves hadn't left the country. He was here, somewhere. Waiting. She turned to Rains, who was already dialing a number. "Who are you calling?" "I know a guy," Rains muttered, ex-FBI. "If Graves is hiding, he'll know where to look." That night, Isabel sat by the window, watching the trees sway under the pale moonlight. A part of her still couldn't believe how far she had come. Months ago, she had been just a grieving sister, desperate to prove Nathan's innocence. Now she was the woman who took down Elliot Graves. Except, he wasn't down yet. A soft chime from her phone made her pulse spike. Unknown number. "You should have stopped when you had the chance." Her blood ran cold. "Rains," she called. He was already by her side before she could speak again. She showed him the message, her hands trembling. His face darkened. "We need to go. Now." The words had barely left his mouth when the cabin's front door exploded inward. The next few moments were a blur. Masked men stormed inside, silent, precise, deadly. Isabel barely had time to react before Rains yanked her behind him, pulling a gun from his jacket. Shots rang out. The room erupted in chaos. Isabel dove behind the kitchen counter as bullets shattered the wooden walls. Rains returned fire, his expression stone cold. "We have to get out," he shouted over the noise. Isabel's heart pounded. They had expected retaliation, but not this fast. A man lunged at her from the side. She barely dodged, grabbing a heavy lamp from the table and slamming it into his head. He crumpled. Rains fired another shot, taking down a second attacker. But more were coming. They were outnumbered. "Back door, go," Rains ordered. Isabel bolted, adrenaline surging through her veins as she sprinted for the back exit. Rains was right behind her. They crashed through the door into the freezing night. Gunfire followed. "Get to the car," Rains shouted. The black SUV they had borrowed was parked down a dirt road. Isabel ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning. Rains fired a few more shots behind them, buying them time. They reached the SUV. Isabel fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she yanked the door open. Rains dove into the driver's seat. "Hold on." The tires screeched against the gravel as the car tore down the road. In the rearview mirror, the cabin erupted in flames. They drove for hours, no talking, no stopping, just running. By dawn, they had crossed into another state, heading for the only place left where they could get help. Sarah Green. The journalist had done what no one else dared to do. She had exposed the truth. Now, she was their only hope. As they pulled into the parking garage of a small news station, Rains finally broke the silence. "You know this isn't over, right?" Isabel nodded. They had survived the attack, but Elliot Graves was still out there, and the next time he came for them, It wouldn't just be to scare them. He'd be coming to kill them. As Isabel stood outside the courthouse, the weight of everything she had fought for settled heavily on her shoulders. This was it. 3 weeks had passed since Elliot Graves had been dragged away in handcuffs, and now the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. Nathan's freedom. The evidence they had uncovered had already sent shockwaves through the country. The DOJ had expanded its investigations, officials had been forced to resign, and corporate giants were scrambling to cut ties with anyone connected to Graves. But for Isabel, none of it mattered until Nathan was free. She adjusted the blazer Maya had lent her, taking a steadying breath. Today, she wasn't the one arguing the case. A seasoned attorney Sarah had connected her with would handle that. But she had fought every step of the way to get here, and she wasn't about to stop now. Behind her, Rain stood with arms crossed, his ever-watchful gaze scanning the crowd. "Nervous?" he asked. Isabel exhaled slowly. No, it was a lie. She had fought against the most powerful corrupt forces in the country, exposed an empire of deception, and taken down Elliot Graves himself. But this was personal. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal experts, and even families who had been affected by Graves's corruption filled the seats. The air buzzed with anticipation. Isabel took her place beside Nathan's attorney, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Across the room, Nathan sat in his orange jumpsuit, his expression unreadable. But when he met her gaze, she saw the hope in his eyes. The hearing began, and the attorney wasted no time laying out the irrefutable proof that Nathan had been framed. The falsified evidence, the suppressed security footage, the confessions from Graves' own former associates. Every point was a dagger in the prosecution's case. Isabel watched as the judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the documents in front of him. And then came the moment she had been waiting for. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked at Nathan. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented before this court, he said, his voice firm, "We find that Mr. Nathan Bennett's conviction was the result of misconduct, falsified evidence, and obstruction of justice. As such, this court overturns his conviction immediately." The room erupted. Isabel barely had time to process before Nathan was pulled into a tight embrace by their parents. Reporters flooded toward them, cameras flashing, voices shouting. She turned, searching for Nathan's gaze. And when she finally found it, it was full of relief, disbelief, and gratitude. "You did it," he mouthed. Isabel smiled, but deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't over yet. Later that evening, as Isabel and Nathan sat in Sarah's office, a news alert flashed across the TV screen. Breaking news. Elliot Graves escapes custody during prison transport. Authorities warn he is armed and dangerous. The room fell into stunned silence. Rains shot to his feet, his jaw clenched. Unbelievable. Sarah swore under her breath. How the hell did this happen? Nathan looked between them, his brows furrowed. Wait, he got away? Isabel didn't move. She just stared at the screen, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Graves was gone. And if she had learned anything about men like him, he was coming for her. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people who had followed the case from the beginning. Isabel sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as the defense presented the final, undeniable evidence. The suppressed security footage, the falsified emails, Elliot Graves' direct involvement in fabricating the case against Nathan. It had taken years of fighting, uncovering hidden truths and exposing one of the largest corruption scandals in the country. But this moment, Nathan's moment, was what mattered most. When it came time for closing arguments, Nathan's defense attorney stood tall, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, the evidence before you is clear. My client, Nathan Bennett, was wrongfully convicted due to the actions of corrupt individuals who manipulated the system for their own gain. Today, we have the opportunity to correct that injustice, to finally right the wrong that stole years of an innocent man's life." Isabel held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs as Judge Holloway considered the words. The room was deathly quiet, and then, finally, he spoke. "The conviction of Nathan Bennett is hereby vacated. He is to be released immediately." For a moment, there was only silence, as if the weight of the words needed time to sink in. Then the courtroom erupted in cheers. Tears spilled down Isabel's face as she turned to Nathan, who stood frozen in shock. Then slowly, his expression cracked into the biggest, most disbelieving grin she had ever seen. Before she knew it, she was in his arms, clutching him like she'd never let go. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel pulled back, shaking her head. "We did it. You believed in me when no one else did. I just returned the favor." In the weeks that followed, Isabel found herself in a whirlwind of attention. Reporters wanted interviews. Activists reached out with messages of support. Even law schools sent her letters of encouragement. She had fought and won against one of the most powerful men in the country. But now, as she sat across from Nathan at their parents' dining table, she realized the fight had changed her. "I want to go to law school," she said, her voice steady. "For real this time. No shortcuts, no disguises. I want to do this the right way." Nathan leaned back in his chair, a proud smile playing on his lips. "You'd be amazing." "You think so?" she asked, uncertainty creeping in. "I know so," he said firmly. "You've already done more than most lawyers ever will." The courtroom was different now. This time, Isabel wasn't standing at the defendant's table, clutching a stack of papers while a judge mocked her presence. She was standing as an attorney. Her own courtroom. Her own fight. Beside her sat her first official client, a young, single mother wrongfully accused of theft. Across from her, the opposing counsel looked unimpressed, underestimating her just as so many had done before. But Isabel only smiled. She straightened her blazer, took a deep breath, and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and confident, "I'm here to defend someone who deserves the truth, and I intend to deliver it." And with that, the journey of Isabel Bennett, a young woman who had once stood alone in a courtroom, laughed at and dismissed, had come full circle. She had fought for justice, she had won, and she was just getting started.